word convict is often viewed as a dirty word, a word used to describe a lawbreaker, a villain, a criminal. But as we look deeper into the history behind the First Fleet and the convicts who travelled on the 11 ships, there is a lot more to the story. Throughout this presentation, the lives of convicts who made the long trip from their homes on the First Fleet will be discussed. The questions will be asked. What crimes did these people commit to have such a serious consequence? How were these people treated during the voyage and once they arrived in Australia? And more specifically, how do the current punishments and treatments of those who commit theft in our society today compare with those of the convicts who were brought on the First Fleet in 1788? In 1787, a group of 11 ships travelled from Great Britain to establish a penal colony that would become the first European settlement in Australia. This group is now known as the First Fleet. The fleet carried people from all walks of life, many of which were convicts. The ships arrived in 1788, and soon after reaching Botany Bay, it was decided by the commander of the First Fleet, Captain Arthur Phillip, that the area was not fit to raise a colony, so the fleet moved north, arriving at Port Jackson on the east coast a short time later. This is the general background of the First Fleet's arrival, but there is much, much more to this monumental trip, especially when it comes to the lives of the convicts. Family History Association of Australia states that even before the ships had embarked to Great Britain, many of the convicts had already been aboard for 7 months. Those who hadn't been aboard the ships were in prisons or holding cells, which weren't much better. In John Howard's 1777 State of the Prisons of England and Wales, he stated that convicts are ironed and thrust into offensive dungeons, some of them without straw or bedding, in which they continue in winter 16 or 17 hours out of the 24 in utter inactivity, and are immersed in the noxious stench of their own bodies. Once the ships were ready to be filled, the convicts were forced to walk long distances to the docks and were loaded in front of crowds of people. In the book Bound for Botany Bay, the authors explain that for many convicts, some of whom had not ventured far in their own country, let alone travelled beyond it, the time before departure must have been intensely emotional. Child space caused countless convicts to become ill over the many months being aboard, and in some cases, the trauma of the move took physical expression in vomiting, hysteria, and confusion. Although the convicts were appointed time each day to exercise on the main deck, 23 convicts died during the voyage, many due to illness triggered by being in confined spaces. After the first few months of travel, the weather became increasingly hot and humid as the fleet sailed through the tropics. Rats and parasites such as bedbugs, lice, cockroaches and fleas tortured those on board, as well as rotting food, the stench of unwashed people and diarrhoea. To add to their horrible situation, the convicts had no change of clothes and no method of drying wet clothing, which meant they were always cold and often stank. A surgeon who travelled with the fleet, SS Warp, wrote on his journal, "During the voyage, a considerable number of adults and nearly all the children have suffered from diseases." This was the account of all on board, including the convicts. In his account, the doctor also explains that for days on end there would be flooding in the lower levels, which were mostly the holds for the convicts. What did these people do to deserve such horrific treatment and terrible conditions? What crimes did these convicts commit? According to the information on the Australian government website, majority of crimes punishable with transportation were related to theft or stealing in some way. These crimes include all theft above the value of 1 shilling, stealing lead, iron or copper, stealing letters, stealing food or drink, stealing fish from a pond or river, stealing roots, trees or plants. Other crimes included perjury, fraud and assault. The varying sentences the convicts received were transportation for 7 years, 14 years, or for the term of their natural life. Transportation as a punishment was not a new thing for Britain. In fact, between 1614 and 1775, over 50,000 people were transported to the English colonies throughout North America. Due to political issues, the use of the North Americas to transport prisoners was no longer an option, so after much deliberation it was decided that the convicts would be sent to Australia. The difference was, Australia was further than any convict had been before, so this was not a popular idea in many circles. and one well-known philosopher, Jeremy Bentham, gave his perspective on transportation.
In my opinion, it serves no useful purpose. It is costly and inhumane. It means banishing the felon from the land of his birth and condemning him to a range of horrible possible fates, which might include shipwreck, drowning at sea, maybe starvation, being devoured by wild beasts, or killed by savages. So what exactly did some of these convicts do to get such a serious punishment? The following case studies include information on some of the convicts from the First Fleet. These were found from an Australian history organisation.
Case Study 1A, James Freeman. Freeman was sentenced to death on the 3rd of March 1784 for highway robbery. He stole the worth of 12 shillings. Freeman was deprived of transportation for 7 years. He was 16 years old when he received to the hulks. Case Study 2A, George Guest. About 20 years old, was sentenced to death on the 4th of March 1784 on 2 counts.
First, 10 live pigs. Second, a chestnut mare. George received several floggings, deprived of transformation for 7 years. Case Study 3A, Esther Abrams. Esther Abrams was tried at Old Bailey, London on the 30th of August 1786 for stealing lace with a value of 50 shillings. She was sentenced to transportation for 7 years and left England on the Prince of Wales, aged about 20 at the time.
These 3 case studies are of real convicts who made their voyage to Australia. They didn't only suffer the pain of leaving their homes, but were in awful living conditions for several months. The following 3 case studies are of those people who have committed some degree of theft in our current day. The information was gathered from the South Australian Government's District Court's sentencing remarks. The dates range between 2012 and 2014.
Case Study 1B, Dylan Jake Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald was sentenced for having used a van without the consent of the owner, and the theft of the magazines from that van. Fitzgerald came across a delivery van with the engine running at Salisbury. He proceeded to take this van in an unplanned and opportunistic whim. He was recognised by 1, if not 2 people near the scene. He was identified in a photographic identification procedure. Fitzgerald was sentenced with 3 years imprisonment. There was a non-parole period set of 21 months. Case Study 2B, Nigel Wilton. The facts are that at approximately 12:30 a.m. on the 7th of January 2013, the victim of the robbery boarded the bus travelling towards Noongar Centre. Upon entering the bus, he noticed 2 young males sitting in the back. One of those young males was Wilton. The victim proceeded to exit the bus at the bus stop closest to his home in Hackham. Both Wilton and the other male got off the bus at the same time and followed him. He then recalls both Wilton and the other male coming up very close to him and asking him for the time. He was very intimidated by this behaviour. On coming face to face with the victim, Wilton then demanded that he hand over his belongings. It was at this time that he noticed that Wilton was holding what appeared to be a black and silver pistol. In a state of shock, he handed over his mobile phone, his wallet, a small amount of cash and some jewellery. Wilton started with a sentence of 4 years imprisonment. Non-parole period was 18 months. Case Study 3B, Adrian Rowan MacArthur. Adrian entered the shop wearing a skull mask, balaclava and hoodie. He was carrying a knife, which he threatened the attendant with before stealing some cash and leaving. As he ran out of the shop, a passing police vehicle saw him running away and gave pursuit. Adrian was sentenced to imprisonment for a period of 4.5 years. A non-parole period was fixed for 2 years and 9 months. These men served their sentences in South Australian prisons, one of which includes Yatala Labour Prison. The living conditions include private living quarters, toilet facilities, bedding, 3 meals a day, a window in each room, vocational training, exercise equipment, televisions, and any healthcare needed. There are clear differences in the punishments that the people from the fleet received and those of the current day. It seems inhumane the way that the people were treated then, and almost unfair that people who commit the same crimes in this day and age can be so comfortable in the prisons. David Hills, in 1788, The Brutal Truth About the First Fleet, describes that many of the convicts had been condemned to be hanged for stealing food or items of clothing, but their death sentences were commuted to transportation. This indicates that for petty theft, such as stealing a loaf of bread, the maximum penalty was death, and the minimum, lashings or other violent physical punishments. In some cases, the punishments weren't all physical, but also mental. For James Freeman, this meant being the town hangman or being shot to death. The Australian Government, in the Regulatory Offences Act 1985, states that the current maximum penalty for theft is 14 years in prison, and the minimum penalty is a $600 fine. Most prisoners have time to call their families and even see them on a weekly basis. According to online records, many of the convicts never saw their families again. The International Corrections and Prisons Association have an ethical code of conduct which affects prison workers and, by extension, prisoners within Australia. Some points within this ethical code include treating individuals with respect. Correctional officials should continue to identify in each individual the potential to become a law-abiding citizen. He or she must exercise reasonable care and skill and support a safe and secure environment for the community by humanely and securely managing individuals under custodial and community sanctions. Correctional officials must recognise the inherent dignity and worth of every human being and ensure that human rights are safeguarded. He or she shall refrain from discriminating against any individual because of race, gender, creed, national origin, religious affiliation, age, disability, or any other type of prohibited discrimination. With the collective evidence within this presentation, a comparison can be drawn between the case studies. 1A stole a large quantity of flour and was sentenced to death, only being allowed to live if he would consent to being the hangman, and then was sentenced to 7 years transportation. 1B stole a van and some magazines. He was taken into custody and was given a mere 21 non-parole sentence for prison. If this is not already such a diverse display of punishment, the conditions for 1A were horrible. He travelled almost a year at sea, surrounded by illness, stink and vermin. 1B has a cell in a protected facility with accessible doctors, a mattress and blanket, and access to phones daily. These comparisons continue with 2A and 2B, which were both related to theft of private property. 2A stole 10 pigs and a horse. 2B robbed a man of his phone, wallet, jewellery and cash. 2A received several floggings, which he probably had permanent damage from, and was sentenced to death. This sentence was changed to 7 years transportation, but he was sent to the other side of the world at only 20 years old. 2B was given a prison sentence of 2 years and 10 months. In the prison, he can have visitations with his family, watch television, and even get an education. Finally, 3A and 3B were both thefts of high value. 3A stole lace worth 50 shillings and was sentenced to 7 years transportation. She died the year she arrived in Australia, from ill health related to the voyage. 3B stole hundreds of dollars from a service station, was sentenced to a 4.5-year prison time with a non-parole period of 2 years and 9 months. He has vocational opportunities and access to fresh air every single day. This provides the conclusion that the punishments and treatments of people today is extremely lenient when compared to those of the 1787 voyage. As a people, we have developed an understanding of valuing human life and respecting people regardless of poor choices they have made. As a country, we give people opportunities to rehabilitate and try to be better. The First Fleet was a brutal and heart-wrenching time for thousands of people. Many individuals and families suffered because of the severe punishments of that time. If the ethical standpoints we have today were in effect in the 1700s, so many families would have been able to stay together. So many people would have not suffered in the horrific ways they did. It's such a true tragedy, the way that people were treated on the voyage from Great Britain. But it gives a more positive perspective on the justice system in place today and makes one grateful for the hope of a brighter future for our country.
Those who are dead are not dead, they're just living in my head. And since I fell for that spell,